It's hour 2 of lesson 2 of Intro to Web Programming. We've set up our first HTML input form. We've had a look at what the form action and methods do. And I just want to show you one other, as I mentioned, easy way to break our form. If we forget to put our end form tag down here, which everybody's going to do at some point or other. So I write my page this way. So I have all the right code, but my end form tag is in the wrong place. All of my inputs and my submit button are actually outside of the form. If I view the page in my browser now, it looks fine, right? There's no indicator because that form's invisible. So it looks like it should be okay. But when I click my submit button, nothing happens. So if ever you're clicking a submit button and nothing's going on, the probable error is your closing form tag is up at the top before all of your inputs and before your submit button. Okay, so this end form always needs to go down at the bottom or it doesn't do anything. Okay, so we set up our form properly now. Now we need to deal with this. So we've done that first page. We now need our process form page that can read and interpret these inputs. So let's go ahead and make a new PHP file. And we'll call it process form. So the name has to match exactly the action line on line 9 or we'll get another 404 error. Okay, so I'll call it process-form. So inside of our body, we want to add some PHP code. I'm going to put on a set of PHP tags. WebStorm nicely generates the closing tag for me. After I open the tag on line 10, on line 9, it automatically generates that closing tag on line 11. But what we want to do is we want to create two variables and store two form inputs in them. We don't have to stick our inputs into variables, but it's much easier because the code for working with the variables, it's much shorter, and the code for working directly with the form inputs is sort of messy. So we should create two variables that have descriptive names. Let's not call them A and B. Typically what I do is whatever my form inputs are named, I create variables with the exact same names. So I have form inputs called name and email. I want two PHP variables called name and email. And in PHP, does anybody remember? We talked about it last week. All variables in PHP start with a particular character. Right, we got to start with a $sign. So I'll create a variable called name. And remember, we said last week, PHP is loosely typed, unlike C# or Java, right? If this was a C# variable or a Java variable, we'd have to declare that it's a string. In PHP, not only do we not do that, we can't do it. If I try and say this is a string, it'll give me an error. So what we want to do is we want to read this variable from, because our form uses post, what PHP will do is it creates an array or a collection or a list of all of the inputs that were posted on the form. And the way we refer to it is this way. If I type $, well, we can actually see the object we need right here. So these are all the built-in arrays or collections in PHP. Which one do you think is going to contain all of the form inputs? Well, which method did we use in our form? Post. So which array are we going to want? The post array. If our form used get, then we'd use the get array. But because our form uses post, the post array contains all of the values from the user inputs. And then in here, we specify name. So we're taking that value, we're storing it in a variable. If this helps, I'll just comment this out. So in C#, this same code would look something like this. You don't have to type it. This is just for illustration. In C# or Java, we called our input box name. That input box, that object has a property called text, and we're putting it into a string variable called name. So that's kind of our equivalent. If we were writing this in Java. My Java is really rusty.
Presumably using first name and last name in COMP1006. And we need to specify two different names at that time.
That's right. So we'd have an input called first name. We'd have a second one called last name. And we'd refer to them as $post first name and $post last name.
So we can use like the same, like only the name for both of them.
No, you can't. So we want to name, just like on a C# or Java form, right? Every input, every object has to have a unique name. So we also want an email variable. And we're going to fill that from $_post email. These are case sensitive. So if we use a capital E here, we need a capital E there. So now we just want to display back a message that shows what inputs the user entered. So we can use the most common command for displaying to the screen in PHP is the echo command. So we're going to display the word name and a colon. Then we'll output our name variable. Remember, the dot means concatenate or append strings together. And then after that, let's put on a line break. We want a new line after that name variable is printed. And we'll do the same thing with email. We're not connecting to the database here. We're not worried about the database. We just want to show that we've accurately processed whatever was typed into our form and that we can access those inputs on the next page. Guess I can do the email version too. But from time to time, if it helps, I'll try to compare what we're doing in PHP into language that we already know. So now I should be able to go back to my browser, submit my form again, and instead of getting a 404 error, we should get this message printed out where it says the name and whatever is entered in the name input, and then should say on the next line the email and whatever email address was entered. Let's try it. So I'm going to go back. I don't need to fill the form out again. I can just submit it. And now it shows me whatever I entered. If I put in different values, whatever's entered in the form, that's what shows up in my post. We said these things were case sensitive. I'm just going to show you. So on my form, my second input box, it was called email all in lowercase. Here, I'm trying to reference my post item called email with a capital E. So if I resubmit my form, notice I don't get an error. If this was C# or Java, I'd get an error, right? It would say email with a capital E, that object doesn't exist. I think the error in C# would say object not set to an instance of an object. We tried to refer to an object called capital E email, and that doesn't exist. I don't get an error here. This is a good thing in one way. It's a really bad thing in the other way. Why is it good and why is it bad? Yeah, it's bad because it didn't crash. There's no error message. So if users are using this application, they may not tell us there's a problem. Having an error is probably better. If this was C# or Java, we'd get an error when we refer to an object that doesn't exist. Not in PHP. PHP doesn't care. It just gives us no value. So our page doesn't crash, the user doesn't see an error message, but it's also going to be harder for us to know that there's a problem and to fix it. So this is one thing about PHP I actually don't like very much. That it's a little too flexible. Okay, can you be more specific?
Actually, when I enter everything, that again it's showing not found.
Okay, it shows page not found. Okay, so if you get page not found, first thing to check is you need to make sure that the action, the name in the action, matches exactly the name of your second page. If it doesn't match exactly, and it's in the same case, you'll get a page not found. Are you doing this locally on your local host? And is the file saved in the same directory? So when you go into your folder in Windows, you see both those pages? Because I know, Milen, you moved your directory, right? You were working in one folder, and then we moved it into your www folder. So you may have created the process page in the old folder. Was that the problem?
Yep.
Right? So if you ever get 404, you check the names, and if the names are correct, actually look in the file tree, in the directory tree, and make sure your files are in the same place. So it is case sensitive. Okay, on which line, what line number? Okay, so check your syntax carefully with what I have on mine. So remember our dot operator, that's our append or concatenate operator. So we're using it to put together some literal text and some PHP variables. You still getting a syntax error?
Yeah.
On which line number?
19.
On 19? I'm going to recreate your error. Okay. So I'm not going to pick on you because we're all going to do it. I'm going to do it. I want to show everybody this. The single most common PHP error. Okay. I've taken out the semicolon here after my line 12. When I refresh it in my browser, notice the error message. The error message is kind of misleading. Look at the line number it says my error is on. It says my error is on line 19. So I come down here, I look at line 19. There is no error on line 19. Line 19 is correct. Now my code editor is saying the error is here. Why does PHP say the error is down here when I've missed a semicolon up here? How come? Cassidy? Right. So without a semicolon separating those two commands, the PHP compiler, it interprets that whole thing. It ignores the comment. It interprets that whole thing as one instruction, and it can't make sense of it because I've put in two commands. It's like writing two sentences together without a period in the middle. Doesn't make sense. So this is always something to check. Whenever we get an error message, a syntax error in PHP, and it gives us a line number, first thing to do is go and check that line. If that line we're sure is correct, then chances are we forgot a semicolon on the previous command. And in fact, my PHP storm is telling me that, that I forgot the semicolon. Okay. We will all do this. I'm probably going to do it every week in this class. You're going to do it too. So that's the first thing to check when you see that syntax error. Did I miss a semicolon up above? Okay. It's a very easy thing to miss. And this is why, for those of you who are in Tom's client-side scripting class yesterday, right? Tom was talking about leaving the semicolons out in JavaScript, and he said you could do it, but it's not a good idea. Because if you get in the habit of leaving them out in JavaScript, you're going to write your PHP code and think, I don't need the semicolons, and then it breaks everything. One little character is enough to crash that whole page. Okay. So we've done 2/3 of this part now. We've built the form that collects data. We've sent it to the server. We've processed it with PHP script. So what we want to do now is we want to add the third piece in here, which is actually being able to save data into our database. But before we do that, we need a place in the database to actually hold some data. So if we're going to build a little music store, we should figure out what do we want? Do we want to store the artists? Do we want to store the albums? Do we want to store the songs? Okay, we'll just have a quick vote. So show of hands for songs. Who thinks we should store songs? So that's 3, 6, 9. Okay, who thinks we should store albums? Okay, and who thinks we should store artists? Okay, so songs is the winner. One question though, before we do songs, one of the things we're going to want to add onto the music store eventually is a photo. So can we do that with songs? If you think yes, we better think about what kind of photos are we going to upload to the song. If we have albums or artists, it's going to be easy for us to include photos, right? Because the albums have a cover and the artists, obviously, we can find pictures of. Any suggestions of how we will find pictures for the songs? Because I'm not entirely sure how we're going to do that. We could put a picture of the album. So then we'd have potentially 5 songs with the same album. So maybe, I'm just kind of thinking out loud. I'm not trying to poo-poo anybody's idea, just thinking about where we're going with this and what we want it to do. So maybe we should stick with albums because we can easily find the album covers. Okay. So let's plan out. Let's think about together. What does it say? Okay, so your page is not in the right place. So check your folder in Windows and make sure the 2 files are in the same folder and that you've named them correctly. So let's think about what information, if we're going to build an albums table in our database, we'll do this together in a minute. We'll need to get connected into our database. What fields should we capture? What things should we store? So if we're going to build a form, kind of like this one, where users can add new albums, what information should we have about the album? Okay, so we'll have a title. Yep, what else should we have? Okay. Yeah, so it'll be a text field, but we're talking about, so we're thinking about the database part, right? We want to design an albums table in our database. Okay, so we need So we could do the launch date, or we'll just store it as the year of the album. We don't need the specific day necessarily. What else? Okay. So like for the cover, you mean? Okay. So for now, the cover we'll leave empty. We're not going to deal with getting into file uploads until later, but we'll do that later on. So we'll get all this in here over the next few weeks. We'll be able to add, edit, delete. We'll secure it. Then later on, we'll add the ability to upload. And then we can create even a gallery page like a Facebook photo album that will show all the album covers we've uploaded. Okay, anything else we should put on here, or is that enough, do you think? I think that's probably good for now. We can always add on. That's the thing about our database. If we find there's something we want to add down the road, we can always just add on additional columns or change our database structure. So what I want you to do is everybody should have MySQL Workbench or know how to access the phpMyAdmin site through your browser so you can access your database. Now you can use your local database or you can use your database on DreamHost, whatever database you're using in your relational database course. Okay. If you're running, mind you, if you're posting your web pages on DreamHost or Azure, you need to use your DreamHost database that you're using for your relational database course. If you're running on your WAMP server locally, you can use your DreamHost database or your local database, doesn't matter. Okay. I'm just going to use my local one, so I don't have to keep putting my password in my code, which I'm broadcasting onto YouTube. So whatever database you're using in your relational database course, I want you to open up, get connected to it. So if you're using your DreamHost database, you can do it this way through your browser. You can go to SQL.Computer Studies, and it will prompt you for your login. Or you probably already have your connection set up in MySQL Workbench. So you can open up MySQL Workbench. They're just two different programs that take you into the same place. Are you using DreamHost in your relational database class? Is anybody using that for their database? You are? Okay. Who's working on their local database? So you can use your local database, but only if you also have a local web server installed. If you've been putting our pages up on Azure, well, the Azure website, it can't connect into your local machine. Your local machine can connect out, but not the other way. Okay. So you may need to connect to your DreamHost database. If you need those credentials, you can find them in your student email. You just need to open up your student email, do a search for the word DreamHost, and you'll find those credentials. I'm just going to connect to my local database for today. And as you know from your database class, once we get connected, we're always going to need to run a use command first, just one time, so that connects us to a particular database. So I'll run the use command. And I have a bunch of tables in my database from previous classes. Doesn't matter that you may have other tables in your database from your relational database class, no problem. So we're going to create a table called albums. I'm going to name it in lowercase. And then I'm going to open up a set of round brackets. I will put this script on Blackboard for you as well, but I'll try to go slowly so you can follow along. We're only going to have to do this once. So we want fields for title, for launch date, for artist, for cover. The other thing that we're going to want is we're going to want some way to uniquely identify all the albums. Have you guys discussed this yet in your database course? Maybe not quite yet. Well, I'll give you a little preview. So the reason we want this is, let's say we accidentally enter the exact same album twice, and we have an exact duplicate. We need some way to identify each record individually. So typically when we create tables in our database, we add some kind of ID field as well. And we want the database to automatically assign a unique ID number. So that way, if we have duplicates, we can uniquely identify each one. For example, here a Georgian, right? What value represents is your unique identifier of your record in Georgian's database? Yeah, everyone has a unique student number, right? So even if we have two students with the exact same name in the exact same program, each student has a unique number that identifies them. So you haven't done this yet in your database course. You're going to do it in the next week or two. So we'll do it today, then it won't look so unfamiliar. So the first field we're going to add is actually going to be called album ID. And I'll use camel case, which is what you're used to using from our fundamentals course. It's what you're going to use for those of you in Tom's JavaScript course. Probably going to use camel case. So what type of data should we use for an ID? Should we use a string? Should we use an integer? Should we use a date? Usually it's going to be a number. So not only is it going to be a number, should the album ID be required or should it be optional? Yeah, it should be required. We can't have an album, just like we can't have a student record in our database without a student number. So we're going to say it's not null. Now the IDs should be automatically generated by the database. So every time we add a new album, we want the database to automatically assign the next available ID. Why would we do this? This is typically what we do when we build any kind of database. We set up a unique ID field, and we want the database to automatically assign the numbers. Why would we let the database assign the numbers? Why don't we assign the numbers every time we add a new album? Sorry? Okay, because we might forget. Yeah. Why else?
You don't necessarily know how much albums you have in your database already. So maybe not share about what album number it is.
Okay, exactly. Let's think about Amazon.com for a minute, or let's think about Facebook, right? So Facebook probably has a profiles table. And in there, every Facebook profile has a unique ID that gets assigned. How many Facebook profiles do you suppose get created every minute? Do you think it ever happens that 2 people or 20 people or 2,000 people create a profile at the exact same time? Is that possible? Yeah, of course it's possible. We have a web application. We can be having people insert data to the same table all at once. So if we try to generate the IDs ourselves, we're going to have a conflict if 2 people or more than 2 people try and create a record at the same time. How do we know which ID number comes next? So all databases have an ability to automatically generate and assign an ID. So if it gets 20 requests at the same time, it will put them in a sequence and make sure it doesn't give the same ID to 2 different records. So the way we do that in MySQL is with the keyword auto_increment. So that means the first album we insert, MySQL will automatically give it an album ID of 1, and then 2. And we don't have to start at 1. If we want, we can start at a higher number. Oftentimes for many websites, we don't want to start at 1. Why not? Why would we want our first ID to be much higher? Well, let's think about if you were buying something online, right? As a customer, when you're done paying, what does the company send you? Yeah, they send you a confirmation with your order number. How confident are you going to be in that company if you get order number 1? What does that tell you about that company? You're the first customer, right? So probably They don't want to give anybody order number 1. So they're going to start the order numbers at like 60,000. So you don't know that you're the first customer they've ever had, right? So in our case, we don't care. We'll start at 1. Doesn't really matter. And then the other thing we want to do to specify that these values have to be unique. No 2 albums can have the same ID. Just like no Amazon orders can have the same ID. No Georgian students can have the same student number. Everybody needs a unique one. We're going to use these keywords, which says primary key. The primary key simply means this is the unique identifier. Every record in this table has its own ID that can't be a duplicate of another one. So in another week or 2 in your database course, every other table you create, you'll know this in your sleep because your verse column is always going to be an ID that's an integer, that's not null, that's auto-incrementing, and it's a primary key. If we look at any of these tables I've created, they'll all look like that. So that's going to be our first column. Now we'll add these other columns. So we'll have title. What data type should we use for the title? It is a string, so it's a Krupa. Yeah, we'll use varchar. Variable length character data. Variable because one title might be, well, if you're Ed Sheeran, your titles are 1 character long, right? If your albums are something else, your titles are longer. We don't know how many characters, so it's variable. But we do have to specify a maximum. How big should we allow this field to be? At the biggest. 30, 40, 50. 50 is sort of the standard unless it's going to be a lot of text. We can maybe say 50. Should the album title be required or should we allow nulls? Yeah, it should be required. We can't save an album without a name. So again, that's going to be not null. We don't need the other stuff. It's not a primary key. We're not auto-incrementing it. Now we've got actually, we could just maybe just call this one year. We don't need to necessarily store a full date. We just want the year. What data type could we have? Yeah, we can just do an integer. Required or optional? Optional? Okay, so we'll leave it. We want to have a year, but maybe we're not sure yet. Maybe an album is being produced but not released yet, but we want to put it in there. We'll have an artist. What type of data would the artist be? Yep. How many characters for the artist? 20 might be small because maybe we have multiple artists. Yeah, maybe we're safer with 50. Now later on, we'd probably want the artist in its own table. And then we'd have a connection between the artists and the albums. We won't worry about that. That's going to be too complicated for our purposes. We just want one table. And then lastly, we're going to have the cover. We actually have a couple of options for the cover. What options do we have for the cover? There's 2 ways we could store, because the cover is going to be a picture. So there's 2 types of data we could use for storing it. So if we store it as a URL, which is typically the easier way, so what data type would we use if it's just a URL, just a link? Yeah, it'd just be a string. If we don't want a URL, what if we want to actually store the image files themselves right in our database? What data type would we use for that? If we want to embed those images right into MySQL. We don't want to do that because it slows down the database and takes up too much storage. But we'd use a blob, a binary large object. It would store those images as binary data right in MySQL. We don't typically do that. We just store a link or a path to the image. So again, maybe we'll do 50 characters. So we have 3 text fields, 2 integer fields, And our first integer field is automatically generated by the database. So all I need to do to execute this, just highlight that command, and I'll click my little execute button here, execute the selected portion of the script. And it tells me my create table command ran. I get a little green check mark with no errors. So we've now set up an empty table in the database. There's nothing in it, but we set up the container to be able to hold the albums we want to work with. If I want to check my table, I can run a describe command and execute that one. And now it shows there's the structure of the table we just set up. 5 columns with the table definitions that we listed. So now we have a place in the database to work with. What we want to do now, just go back to our diagram for a second. So we've set up our database, and that's typically what we do first. This is usually the first place when we're starting a web application or any application. We figure out what data do we want to store, what does it look like, how does it relate together, and then we design and build our database. Have you guys you haven't done database diagrams yet, have you? Where you actually draw them out? And there's some neat tools for that. You're going to do that in a few weeks. So we map out what our database looks like. It's going to look kind of something like this. So for example, here's a picture of what iTunes might look like. We're not building all of iTunes, we're just building the album part, right? So we have artists, we have recordings, and then we have connections between them. So you're going to be doing this in your database course soon. So we design out, this is probably a better one. We design out our database and we run our create table scripts to build that database and the connections between the tables. So that's this part down here. So we're done. We don't need to do anything else in our database today. Just set it up. So we're going to take a break in a minute. In the last hour of class, what we want to do, we're going to build another form. So we're going to need a form that kind of matches what's in our database, right? We're going to need an input for title. We're going to need an input for the year. And we're going to need an input for the artist. We'll leave out the cover. For now, we'll add that later on in the term, the ability to browse and upload an image. So we're going to build our form. And then the last thing we're going to do today is build a PHP page that, like this one, it'll take those form inputs, but rather than just print them on the screen, our page is going to connect to our albums table we just built, and we want to save that information into the database. So it's stored permanently. And we'll put 4 or 5 albums into our database before the end of class today. So next week when we come back, what we want to do is start building pages that will display the albums using PHP in our browser. So we can see either the whole list, or we can let a user pick one album by the title and see the rest of the information. So that's what we're going to do next week. Anybody have any questions so far? Rush?
As you told us, like, we go from Amazon and they send us order number like 60,000 or something. How we do that? Like, right now it would start from 1.
Yes.
And like it's going to go for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then ahead, like 1,230 and 31, 32, and like that. Then how we do that? How
do we get it to start at a different number? I haven't done this for a while. I think it's like this, but I have to check. It may be like this. I'm going to just check. It might be something like that. I'll have to, no, it's not like in that. Haven't done it for a while. Let's check. Google's our friend, and my memory's not so good. So MySQL set. There is an easy way to do it. So you know what? We can do it. We can create the we've already created it, so we can't run the create again, right? We'll get an error. It'll say the albums table already exists. If I run this command, so let's do that. Let's start somewhere other than 1, just for fun. Well, I'll say alter table, so change the existing table, albums. Auto increment equals, what number do you want to start at instead of 1?
I would say 1,000.
Okay, sure. So if I just execute it this way, we don't see anything. It says it worked. We're not really going to know. We won't know for sure until we start inserting data. So after the break, once our PHP page is working, we can look at what's inside and we'll see, hopefully those album IDs are going to start at 1,000 rather than at 1. We hope. So typically we'll build the table and then we'll immediately modify it and change the starting number. One other important point is these numbers can never be reused. So if we create album number 2000 and we delete it, the next album that gets in, it can't be, there'll never be another number with album ID 2000. That ID is gone permanently. Cannot be reused, is how they work. So the database keeps track of which numbers have been used, and it will never reassign a number, even if that's been numbers been deleted when you use auto increment. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break here, and when we come back, we'll build our album form and our save album page and try and get some data saving into our database.